And one more presenter, and then we're going to go through any other job announcements or event announcements. Sophia Liu from the US Geological Survey is going to talk about a project at FEMA involving crowdsourcing. Sophia, explain all of that.
Thank you so much. So hello everyone. I'm excited to share this. I hope to make this interesting for you. So I do work at the US Geological Survey as an innovation specialist, but I was brought in by Chris Vaughn, if you know him. He's the Geospatial Information Officer at FEMA. And you know, he's been thinking about doing crowdsourcing and leveraging it for some time, but as my colleague Emily Marticello, who is also the crowdsourceress on this effort, she would say it took two short women to get this actually going. So we got this going at the National Response Coordination Center. And in some ways, I like to take the slogan that Brock Long had written on this, this board of don't think outside the box, forget the frickin' box. So that's kind of what we were able to do. We were able to think about how do we leverage the public in different ways and leverage crowdsourcing. So this is our unit of other folks that were involved. We were even on Vice News, so check that out. Next slide. So So one of the things is I want to point out we all are leveraging crowdsourced data all the time. I know I do it when I drive. I use Waze and Google Maps. Waze, you know, I leverage the alerts because I want to know when there are police around. But you know, Google Maps, it's the traffic data, the real-time traffic data that allows more situational awareness for me to know when's the shortest route as I get closer to my destination. But you know, I think you all notice that when you see the reCAPTCHA, that's another example of crowdsourcing happening. You're always being asked to do this to determine if you're a robot or not. So this is happening, and we just have to we need to raise awareness of why we all need to use crowdsourced data. So this is sort of, you know, one quote that really, it was Hurricane Harvey that really got Chris Vaughn to call me up and say, hey, can you come to the National Response Coordination Center and help us with this crowdsourcing stuff? Because people are posting stuff on social media. There was a lot of use of how do we leverage the public, and people are getting real-time information from things like Twitter and Facebook or things like that. So how do we start to leverage this information? In my role, since I also co-chair this federal community of practice for crowdsourcing and citizen science, is leverage the expertise and say, there's also these digital humanitarian networks that exist. There's all sorts of digital volunteers that already exist. How do we leverage them? So next slide. So here's just like a quick overview of all of our activations. We've done 4 so far, and during steady state time, we developed this crowdsourcing playbook to kind of have a guidebook. I don't expect you to read all this, but we've made progress, and over time, we not only leverage digital volunteers, we also leverage the private sector, which is something that FEMA really was trying to recognize as how the private sector can be, if you think of the whole community approach, we need to leverage them, and especially at the tech sector, we can leverage their crowdsourced data, which I'll mention later. So next slide. So one of the new things that FEMA started doing in the past year was create these community lifelines. If you ever know about FEMA, they have these emergency support functions, and I never remember what the number means to the actual, you know, meaning of that ESF. But these lifelines, I think, get to really what's the kind of information that you can bring together that's not specific to an agency. So you got safety and security, food, water, sheltering, health and medical, energy, power and fuel, communications, transportation, and hazardous waste. So if any of you do work in these areas, I think there could be some potential collaboration. So one project that, I'm sorry you can't see the top part, but basically there was an initial effort by FEMA to look at crowdsourcing. So FEMA always leverages Civil Air Patrol imagery, so these are volunteers that are flying and taking pictures, sometimes not totally guided, they just take random pictures, but if you tell them, like, take certain images, then they help some GIS consultants basically develop this viewer where you look at a Civil Air Patrol imagery and then mark, you know, what level of damage do you see. And the goal here, and we even had the Civil Air Patrol volunteers, while they're not flying around, to actually analyze their own images that they collected. And maybe hopefully they realize sometimes these images are not helpful, so it might guide them to take better photos. But you know, the goal, like the way Chris Vaughn would put it, is how do we cut the check to these people that need money after a disaster without having to have someone individually go to each house and say, okay, this was the level of damage, flood damage, or whatever it is that they had. Let's cut the check early with remote sensing imagery and the use of volunteers. Next slide. So some other examples of how we leveraged digital volunteers was just, we had all these different lifelines and different digital volunteer groups. These are all like the acronyms are all these different names of folks like Standby Task Force, CEDAR, NAPSIG. They helped create very specific maps. Next slide. So as an example, when Hurricane Maria was really when we first activated. And the task that when the previous administrator, Brock Long, was like, we need to know what are the status updates on 71 hospitals. So we thought, okay, as HHS and other official resources, agencies were trying to collect on this data of what are the updates of 71 hospitals, we thought, well, let's put this out to the digital volunteers and see what they can do. And we were able to leverage the digital volunteers to collect more information and different kind of information on like unlisted health facilities that weren't in their initial 71 faster than the official folks. Because if you imagine, these folks are on the ground trying to walk through all this debris in Puerto Rico, and of course it's not going to be easy for them to get updates on all these 71 hospitals. Whereas these digital volunteers were leveraging stuff online, just their networks, other radio, things like that, since not a lot of them use social media in Puerto Rico per se, to get this information faster. Next slide. Another was shelter information. So this group, Code for America, as well as CEDAR Digital Corps, they were not only leveraging what American Red Cross was putting out in terms of their shelters, but they were trying to find other information of what kinds of shelters were out there, which ones allowed pets, other things like that, other medical assistance that they were able to provide. So this also proved to be very useful for Michael and Florence because it was a little different information than what the officials were providing. So it's the timeliness. Sometimes in the beginning of the disaster, the digital volunteers were able to provide a little bit more quicker information, and then eventually the official kind of efforts caught up. Do any of you know NAPSIG, the National Alliance for Public Safety? So this is a really great group they have really good geospatial or GIS kind of expertise. So there's a particular person, Paul Doherty, that was really the rock star here in helping to create some of these different maps. But essentially, this was a search and rescue map that he combined the official as well as the crowd rescue kind of folks, what folks were doing with Cajun Navy, people on the ground helping to do search and rescue kind of efforts, and pulling that all together into one series of maps. They also have been developing all these photo story maps. So basically, they would work with GIS Corps, another digital volunteer group, and essentially have them mine social media data and other places where there were images to a certain location of damage, and then put it all in this photo story map kind of environment. So this is something that a lot of people, at least in the emergency management community, leverage. Next slide. Then there was also just the coordination and leveraging of existing crowdsourcing platforms. So I know a lot of you, do all of you know Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team?
Yeah.
Yes, because they're awesome. So go to the next slide. So one example, this was especially helpful for Hurricane Maria, and really a good case study of that before was with Haiti, where these were areas that were not well mapped. And so they did an incredible job of a whole bunch of projects that were created to basically with 5,400 volunteers, they were able to map 1.4 million buildings and 45,000 kilometers of roads that didn't really exist before. So this was something super important for, when you're on the ground and as an emergency manager, you need to really understand where things are. And then there's this whole other issue of addressing in Puerto Rico, which is another effort that the government is exploring as well, and other related organizations. But this is really an awesome project and a really good example of crowdsourcing and crowd mapping. And this could be done even before a disaster, but usually, everyone cares about things when there's a disaster, so this is when you get more volunteers. Next slide. Another really fascinating effort was just really working with the private sector. So one of the kinds of dashboards that the GIS team at the National Response Coordination Center developed were these two crowdsourced maps, which was really neat. One was using Waze and one was using GasBuddy in pulling in that data and then showing it on in the NRCC on the big screen. So it was kind of neat to show see, this is crowdsourced data that you can leverage. And even the Department of Energy used the GasBuddy data and put it in their situational reports. So I think there's a lot of socialization and a lot of people realizing how valuable this information is than just the typical way in which they get this data, which is sometimes outdated fairly quickly when you're working in an emergency environment. Next slide. So here again are the bigger versions of it, but I like that the GIS team was able to pull this data in because we were able to get a good feed with the help of folks from Esri and be able to use their operations dashboard kind of tool to make the information much more visible. Because basically when I first started the NRCC, it was like these reports that were, these senior leadership briefings were just these 20, 30-page text documents that no one really could understand in a very short term, like an environment where you just can only take so much information. And this is the kind of information that we need to communicate to, help people make decisions. Next slide. Another really interesting data set is the what Google calls the busyness data. Now, have any of you looked at like Google Maps and you look at a business and you see how, this is sort of a GIF, when you go to a major business, it tells you like how busy is it right now? Like Local 16, I wonder how busy is it right now? We probably have a lot of GeoDC feeds, folks. And it's just the fact that you've got your phone here on you and we're all in this place. So we're passively providing this data to Google, like all these companies. We're freely giving away our very rich data that we should hopefully be getting money for, but no. But we can use this data to know where are certain businesses be finally getting more folks back in to their environment after a disaster, or when there's a lot happening right before a disaster because everyone's getting supplies, whatever it might be, or when restaurants are starting to open, whatever it might be. So this is something we're also trying to leverage. Next slide. So these are just some examples. There's a lot of text, I know, but here's some examples of how we've got certain groups that are providing very specific maps, crowdsourced maps. And so if you kind of see that there might be something you can help with, we would love to collaborate with you. What we're trying to do is how do we create some template mission assignments so that we can directly work with these digital volunteers, because it's still kind of a new thing for FEMA and just the rest of the federal government to figure out how do we ethically and logistically and in some way work with digital volunteers to provide voluntary help. Next slide. So one of the things that I helped develop was just the story map of all these different crowdsourced maps that were created for Hurricane Michael. We're trying to build this out that is based on more operational kind of information of how many shelters are open and closed over time, because essentially this is just dots on a map and that's only so useful. How do we communicate information that helps people make decisions during an emergency for the whole community? So this is I work at USGS, yes, but I was actually just at FEMA today to kind of help push this FEMA crowdsourcing effort. So if you're interested and would like to collaborate, feel free to talk to me or email us here. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sophia.